So people sometimes ask me how I got interested in critical realism, and looking back, it all goes back to the spring of 1993. I was about to start writing my dissertation, and I was plunged into an epistemological crisis. Fittingly enough, the crisis was the result of a complex conjuncture of causes. There were, first of all, withering critiques of comparative historical sociology by well-known quantitative methodologists, and ongoing attacks on cultural and structural analysis by an insurgent band of rational choice theorists, amongst other factors. Was it possible to make causal arguments about rare events like revolutions, I wondered? Do cultural and social structures exist in reality or just in our theories? And if so, is it legitimate to compare them across large scales of time and space? These are some of the questions that sparked my crisis. So I spent that time avoiding dissertation writing and searching for answers, reading widely in the philosophy of science, and drafted a paper that defended historical sociology. It attacked logical positivism and sketched out a position that I called at that time constructive realism. By the summer of 1993, I'd gotten over the crisis, and at the annual sociology meetings, I had lunch with this young hotshot historical sociologist named George Steinmetz, who had come to a position that was eerily similar to mine. He said, you should really read about something called critical realism, and there's this guy, Roy Bhaskar, you really ought to read some of his stuff. You don't remember this, I figured. I made a mental note, and didn't really follow up on this for another 10 years. So by then, it's 2004. And by this time, the rational choice theorists had conquered political science, so had by this time also inspired a major counterinsurgency. And they were now attempting another hostile takeover of historical sociology. In this case, they had rebranded themselves as analytical sociologists. And I've been invited to an author meets critics panel with their leader and CEO, Peter Hedstrom, who had just published a marketing brochure called Dissecting the Social. I'm being a little catty here. In preparing my response, I finally got around to reading some Bhaskar, and I have to say that it was an electrifying experience for me. Again and again, Bhaskar said things that I had been thinking for a long time, except more clearly. So what was I sold on? Well, the two elements of critical realism that I found most useful in thinking about historical sociology are its theory of emergence and causation, and I'll just very briefly say a bit about that in the 15 minutes that I have today. So as I mentioned, during the 1990s, American political science was temporarily taken over by rational choice theory. And here's how the rational choice shakedown worked. Nice little theory you have there, but I'm afraid I'll have to see your micro foundation, or else. So methodological individualism had been transformed from a methodological instrument into a categorical imperative. The imperative was based on a certain prejudice, an ontological prejudice, namely that there are no structures or cultures, just individuals and their interactions. Now, in truth, rational choice theory didn't win that many converts in sociology, but it did have a surprising number of sympathizers, especially in micro-sociological fields that focus mainly on interactions between individuals. Of course, most sociologists at least tacitly presume that social and cultural structures exist. After all, if they didn't, what would be the point of sociology? But most structural and cultural sociologists are not as good as they could be at defending themselves against the reductionist shakedown. It tends to leave them tongue-tied. So here's where the concept of emergence can be quite helpful. So basically, emergentists argue that a whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. Greater in what sense, though? For some, it's qualitative properties. Properties that are real only insofar as they're perceived. Philosophers sometimes refer to this as epistemological emergence. For others, it's causal powers. Powers that are real whether or not they are perceived. And this is sometimes referred to as ontological emergence. Critical realists are ontological emergentists. For us, an emergent structure is one that possesses causal powers that are not possessed by its parts in isolation. Now, where do the powers come from? For some, there's no answer. Emergence is, in the end, mysterious. Substances can't be reduced to their parts. Let's call this holism. For others, the powers of a whole have to do with the composition and organization of their parts. So let's call this compositionalism. Critical realists embrace compositionalism. They believe that reduction can be a useful tool that can help us to understand what makes a structure the kind of structure that it is and gives it the kinds of powers that it has. But they reject the reductionist imperative. Sometimes it's the form of the whole that best explains the activity of the parts rather than the other way around. Let me say a bit more about the parts and powers of social structures. The British social theorist and critical realist Margaret Archer suggests a tripartite social ontology. It consists of structure, agency, and culture, SAC for short. For her, structure refers to relation. I prefer a slightly different formulation. In my minimalist social ontology, structures consist of material artifacts, human persons, and cultural signs, and, importantly, their interrelation. These relations can likewise be organized into three basic categories: object-object, subject-object, and subject-subject. In my view, which I can't really defend here, an adequate theory of structure needs to include all of these elements in relation. Under some description, as philosophers say, I'm not attached to these particular formulations, or not overly attached. So much for parts. What about powers? Now, some realists are essentialists about powers. The Australian philosopher of science, Brian Ellis, argues that the world consists of natural kinds and their essential powers. In Plato's oft-cited phrase, Ellis believes that reality can be cut at its joints. Like the periodic table, Ellis's paradigmatic example. I confess that, as I learned, like Dan Little, I'm not that kind of realist. On my view, kinds of powers can only be defined relationally. Take a simple example: water, H2O. Chemically pure water is not humanly potable. Drink a lot of it, turns out, and you'll die. It will leach all the sodium out of your body. Water's kind and water qua power, then, can only be defined relationally. And what is true of water is true a fortiori of social kinds and powers, such as capitalism and exploitation, or state and imperialism. The critical realist account of strong social emergence provides a firm philosophical foundation for comparative historical sociology. It shows why it's legitimate to focus on large-scale historical events and social structures. It implies that the emergence of new social structures must be one of the central tasks of any social science worth the name. It suggests the limits of a universalistic methodological individualism, or indeed of any universalistic theoretical framework. And the theory of compositional emergence provides a clear rationale for comparative analysis. After all, if emergent powers and properties are indeed a function of the internal relations between parts, then it's important to know which relations are parts and which are accidental. Now, by the spring of 1993, at the time of my epistemological crisis, most historical sociologists, myself included, had already made peace with positivism. The Harvard sociologist Theda Skocpol had negotiated the terms. She argued that there was no real difference between the logic of survey research and historical sociology. Both used comparison to make inferences about causation. The only difference between survey research and historical sociology, she argued, was sample size. In 1991, Skocpol's colleague, Stanley Lieberson, published a steering critique of her version of the comparative method. It was entitled Small Ends and Big Conclusions. If you take the logic of survey research seriously, he pointed out rightly, then getting from small ends to big conclusions requires some very strong assumptions. But what if that logic is mistaken to begin with? What if the positivist view of social and historical causation is just completely implausible from the get-go? Then Skocpol's representation of her argument is misleading, and Lieberson's critique of it falls flat. Let's take a closer look. Sociological positivists typically conceive of social causation in terms of what I call the billiard ball model. This model goes back to Hume. In the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume invites us to imagine the scientific observer as a giant eyeball suspended over a billiard table, passively watching repeated collisions between the balls. The billiard ball model still haunts the causal imaginary of contemporary sociology and of social science more generally. It also underlies the dominant theory of causation with analytic philosophy as well, Lewisian counterfactualism. All represent causation in terms of two-dimensional node and arrow diagrams. Such representations are fundamentally inadequate to social reality in numerous ways. To begin, the social world is not two-dimensional. It consists of multiple levels and scales. Sometimes the causal arrows point up or down rather than forwards or sideways. Second, human persons are not billiard balls. They're self-moving and internally motivated. Third, the social world, hat tip to Dan, is ontologically heterogeneous. It includes material artifacts and cultural symbols as well as human persons. Fourth, causal relations in the social world do not always involve physical contact and energy transfer. Often they're symbolically mediated, sometimes even symbolically driven. Fifth, social causes do not always perceive their effects. Often, more often I would argue, they're simultaneous with them. Sixth, scientific research is not a form of passive observation. It involves active intervention. Science probes reality. The same is true of historical research. Seventh, the social world does not have side bumpers. It's an open system. One game can impact on another and often does. Eighth, the rules of the game can and do change over time, as can the balls and the table themselves. Social worlds are historically and culturally variable. I could go on, but you get the idea. The billiard ball model is just completely inadequate. So how should we think about historical causation? The early critical realism of the 1970s and 80s appealed to the notion of causal mechanism. Some critical realists still prefer this language, so do more and more social scientists. I'm not willing to give up on it, but I am increasingly uncomfortable with it. To be sure, it is an improvement over the billiard ball model, at least as three-dimensional after all. But there are certain ways in which the mechanism metaphor can be misleading that we need to attend to. When we hear the word mechanism, we tend to think of small, self-contained units composed of physically interconnected parts that behave in a highly regular and predictable fashion. We think of something like a mechanical clock. But the social world is not like a mechanical clock either. It's not fully self-contained. It cannot be sealed off from nature or history, not even with the greatest imaginable effort. Its parts are not necessarily small. Many of them aren't physical either, nor are the connections between them. And while there are a few social structures that behave like clockwork, I tend to think of the German and Japanese train systems, there are exceptions. They are the exception. So what is the alternative? At the moment, I'm more attracted to a powers account of causation, specifically one in which structures are the bearers of powers and causation is a process rather than an event. More specifically still, one in which powers and structures are understood in relational rather than essential terms. Let me draw this latter contrast out just a little bit more. Now, I've already mentioned Brian Ellis, and I think this gives a very, very good example of the way in which kind and powers can typically only be understood in a relational fashion. And I think this is true even more of complex social structures such as the state, for example. Kinds of powers can really only be defined relationally. All right, to conclude, what's the upshot here? Well, if the billiard ball model is wrong, then survey research has no title to the epistemological privileges that it claims, and historical sociologists and social historians have no reason to mimic it anymore. Indeed, if the critical realist view of causation is anything like correct, then historical sociology and social history are at least tacitly premised on a far more adequate theory of causation than survey research is, one that observes multiple different levels and scales of causation, one that attends to complex conjunctures between multiple different structures and processes, and finally one that attends to the open-ended nature of the social world.